Transylvania, villagers believed that the dead could rise to spread plague.
The undead plague carrier, the vampire, Nosferatu.
While deep in the Carpathians, a hidden school was said to train sorcerers under the devil himself. In this video, we'll uncover the terrifying origins of Nosferatu, not the film character, but the folkloric vampire born from fears of pestilence and famine, and connect it with the legend of the Scholomance, a medieval academy where chosen students supposedly learned to command storms, summon demons, and pay with their souls. We'll explore Romanian Strigoi and Moroi, the vampire panics that terrified Europe, and how these myths transformed into the Nosferatu that still haunts popular culture today. Stay until the end to learn how the cursed film Nosferatu itself became an undead legend, surviving attempts to destroy it just like the monsters it portrayed. Transylvania was a land trapped between empires. The Habsburgs, the Ottomans, and the Romanian principalities fought endlessly over it, and ordinary people paid the price. Villages were raided, crops destroyed, and epidemics spread with every passing army. Generations grew up knowing that hunger and death could arrive at any moment. And the most terrible part was that no one had an explanation they could trust. Medicine was almost non-existent. Priests blessed homes, sprinkling holy water over the sick, while healers mixed garlic with herbs or animal bones to prepare charms. Religion and superstition were two sides of the same survival instinct. When entire families died in just weeks, villagers looked toward the cemeteries for answers. They dug up the dead, and what they found only deepened their fear. Corpses often appeared swollen, with blood around the lips and nails that looked longer than before. One thing that was very strange is that these were natural effects of decomposition, but to them, it meant the dead had been feeding on the living. The measures they took were shocking. A wooden stake through the chest, decapitation, or the burning of a heart to ash. Those ashes were sometimes stirred into water and forced on survivors as a cure against the plague. Garlic was placed on windows, iron rods hammered above graves, and in some regions, even animals were sacrificed over the corpse to seal it in the ground. These rituals weren't stories. They were carried out in village after village when fear spread. The Carpathian Mountains reinforced this atmosphere. Isolated valleys, endless forests, and nights of heavy fog convinced people that the world around them was full of hidden threats. A shepherd hearing voices in the dark, or a hunter finding a grave disturbed by animals, could easily become proof that the dead were walking again. What is unsettling is how often these accounts repeated across the region, enough to become part of daily life. From this climate, two major legends were born. For peasants, the Strigoi and Moroi explained the sudden epidemics, the restless dead preying on the living. For the elites, the Scholomance became a way to describe disasters on a larger scale, a secret school in the mountains where disciples of the devil learned how to summon storms and unleash destruction. Both legends grew out of the same fear that human suffering wasn't random, it was guided by powers beyond human control. Among all the shadows cast by Transylvanian folklore, one word became immortal: Nosferatu. What makes it so strange is that it doesn't appear as a stable category in Romanian tradition. It entered Western imagination through Emily Gerard, a Scottish writer who lived in Transylvania during the late 19th century. In 1885, and again in 1888, she published The Land Beyond the Forest, a collection of observations about the beliefs and customs of the peasants. She described the Strigoi, revenants who returned from the grave to torment the living, and the Moroi, spirits tied to illness and misfortune. But instead of using those names directly, she wrote Nosferatu. She even claimed that this was the local word for vampire. Here is where the enigma starts. Romanian scholars have long noted that the term does not appear in authentic folklore collections of the time. Instead, it seems to be a distortion. Many point to Nekurat, which literally means unclean, and was used to describe demonic or impure beings. Others trace it to Nesuferit, meaning intolerable or odious, a word that could have been misheard by someone unfamiliar with the language. One thing that is very strange is that Gerard insisted the peasants used the word, while Romanians themselves denied ever having heard it. The real twist came with Bram Stoker. While preparing his novel Dracula in the 1890s, he read Gerard's work and adopted the mysterious word. In his notes, he scribbled, "Nosferatu equals vampire," treating it as an official category. But in Dracula, he didn't use it as a mere name. He presented it almost as a condition, a cursed state of being that transformed humans into predators. In Stoker's hands, Nosferatu became a diagnosis of undeath, a vampiric disease that spread across generations. And this is what makes the story so disturbing. Nobody can confirm where the word truly came from. It may have been a linguistic accident, or it may have been Gerard mishearing local dialects. But there is always the possibility, unsettling as it is, that she recorded a fragment of folklore so rare and so taboo that even Romanians preferred to bury it. That ambiguity gave the term its power. It feels like a ghost of a word, suspended between authentic tradition and literary invention, carrying the weight of both. The most terrible consequence was that Nosferatu overshadowed the real folklore. Outside of Romania, few readers ever heard of Strigoi or Moroi. Instead, this single obscure word became the symbol of the vampire for an entire century. When we strip away the confusion around Nosferatu, what remains are the creatures that Romanians themselves feared, the Strigoi and the Moroi. These weren't elegant aristocrats in castles. They were far more terrifying because they lived inside the daily life of villages, blamed for sickness, failed crops, and sudden deaths. The Strigoi, or living Strigoi, were people cursed from birth or marked by strange signs. A child born with a caul, with a tail-like appendage, or as the seventh son of the same sex, could be suspected. Villagers believed such individuals carried an inner corruption that allowed their spirit to leave the body at night. That wandering double would slip into houses, sit on the chest of sleepers, or drain the energy of animals. One of the most disturbing things is that these accusations often fell on neighbors who were already outsiders, meaning entire families lived under suspicion their whole lives. Then there were the Strigoi Morti, the dead Strigoi. These were revenants, corpses that returned from the grave to torment the living. Signs included livestock dying without cause, children wasting away, or relatives falling sick, one after another. The body of the suspected Strigoi was dug up, and if it looked too fresh, with red lips or long nails, that was taken as proof. Rituals were brutal: stakes through the heart, heads cut off, or hearts cut out and burned. In extreme cases, the ashes of that heart were mixed with water and given to family members as a cure. These practices were recorded as late as the 19th century, showing how real the fear remained. The Moroi represented a different kind of threat. They were usually thought to be the spirits of unbaptized children or the restless dead, denied proper burial rites. Unlike Strigoi, they didn't appear in visible form. Their attacks were invisible, stealing breath during sleep, leaving people weak, thin, and ill. Families who lost children without baptism often lived with the suspicion that their spirits had turned into Moroi, haunting the community from the shadows. Other figures rounded out this network of fears. The Prikolici were revenants that came back as wolves or monstrous dogs, hunting at night and attacking the living. The Varkalak was even more frightening, an astral predator described as a wolf or dragon that could rise into the sky and swallow the sun or moon, causing eclipses. These stories tied the idea of vampirism not only to the graveyard, but to cosmic disasters, placing local fear into the scale of the heavens. What is important to understand is that these beings were not defined by drinking blood. That image came later through literature and cinema. In authentic Romanian folklore, Strigoi and Moroi were blamed for far more devastating things: plagues, famine, crop failure, infertility, or storms. They explained why entire villages starved, why herds collapsed, or why epidemics spread without mercy. The most terrible part was that people had no other framework for these disasters. The supernatural was their only explanation, and the vampire was not a romantic figure. It was the embodiment of every crisis that could destroy a community. In the shadow of the Carpathian Mountains, peasants whispered about a place they never dared to seek. They called it the Solomanta, the Scholomance, a hidden school buried deep within the rock, or beneath the waters of a nameless black lake near Sibiu. This was no ordinary academy. It was said to be run by the devil himself, and only the most daring or the most cursed would ever step inside. Each generation, exactly 10 students were chosen. Nobody agreed on how the selection took place. Some said the devil marked children at birth, while others claimed ambitious families secretly offered their sons in hopes of gaining forbidden power. Once chosen, they vanished from ordinary life for 9 full years. During that time, they lived in complete darkness. They never saw sunlight, never touched the outside world. The most terrible part is how villagers imagined those 9 years, not as study, but as a slow hollowing out of the soul, where fear, hunger, and shadow stripped the students of what made them human. The lessons themselves read like an inventory of nightmares. The master taught them the secret language of animals, so they could command flocks, serpents, or wolves. He taught them how to gather clouds and split them with lightning, to summon rain or withhold it, turning fertile valleys into famine. He instructed them in the hidden mechanics of nature, how to bend rivers, how to call storms, how to manipulate the growth of crops. One thing that was very strange in these tales is that the devil did not simply give power. He made his disciples understand how nature itself could be twisted, as if the entire environment were just another body to be drained and controlled. At the end of the 9 years came the final reckoning. 9 of the students were released, pale and broken, returning to their villages as something other than what they once were. But the 10th never came back. That last student was taken as eternal tribute. He became the devil's servant, condemned to remain underground, riding the monstrous Zmu, a dragon-like serpent said to sleep beneath the nameless lake. Folklore insisted that this beast was the source of the devil's power to hurl unnatural lightning. Some accounts even described a hidden device, forged in the abyss of the lake, where storms were bred and thunderbolts crafted like weapons. The imagery is chilling. A hidden lake in the mountains, a reptilian creature chained beneath it, disciples who spend nearly a decade without sunlight, and the inevitable sacrifice of 1 out of 10. Villagers believed this explained why storms would erupt suddenly over Sibiu, or why lightning struck fields in patterns too precise to be natural. To them, the Scholomance was not just a story. It was a reason why nature itself could feel like an enemy. What frightened people the most was not the devil at the center of it, but the transformation of the students. 9 years in darkness, surviving on terror, taught them to abandon fear itself. When they returned, they no longer acted like ordinary men. Their eyes were described as hollow, their skin unnaturally pale, their emotions dulled. They carried secret books written during their final test, where they copied down everything they had learned. Those manuscripts were said to contain the raw machinery of reality, how to command rain, how to split the sky, how to call famine. For the villagers, these graduates were already less than human. They had been emptied, then refilled with something else. And this was the part that truly linked the Scholomance to vampirism. The absence of the sun, the draining of humanity, the transformation into pale, hollow figures who returned to spread ruin. It all sounded like the origin of the vampire legend. Not a parasite feeding on blood, but a disciple remade in the image of his master, surviving by pulling life away from others. When Emily Gerard, a Scottish writer living in Transylvania, published her Transylvanian Superstitions in 1885, she gave the West its first written account of the Scholomance. Her text would later become a direct source for Bram Stoker while preparing Dracula. Gerard described a hidden school of black magic where the devil taught his students to command storms and speak with animals, and where one unfortunate soul was always kept as tribute. For many readers in the Victorian era, this was the first time they had encountered the name, and it sounded so strange, so archaic, that it carried instant weight. But modern philologists argue that even the name Scholomance is a distortion. Some suggest it derives from Solomona, a Romanian word that might mean disciple of Solomon. Others, like the scholar Moses Gaster, went further, claiming the myth preserved echoes of ancient traditions about King Solomon, whose legendary wisdom was said to include the ability to command demons and bind spirits. The Solomon of folklore was not just a biblical king, but a master of hidden knowledge, precisely the kind of figure who could have served as an archetype for the devil as a teacher. This connection grew stranger when scholars pointed to parallels in Spain. In Salamanca, a medieval legend told of a cave beneath the city where a mysterious master taught necromancy to chosen disciples. There too, the price of initiation was that one of the students would never leave, claimed forever by the hidden teacher. The resemblance to the Romanian tale was uncanny. A subterranean school, a pact, the loss of 1 out of 10. Whether this was coincidence or proof of a pan-European myth of dark academies, the similarity was enough to convince many folklorists that the Scholomance and the Salamanca cave were branches of the same root. Other interpretations leaned into the vampiric imagery. 9 years underground without sunlight, emerging pale and transformed, surviving terror as their true initiation. All this echoed later vampire traits. Scholars like Elizabeth Miller noted how Stoker folded these ideas into his novel. Dracula himself is described in the book as having studied at the Scholomance, learning forbidden arts in the service of his own transformation. For Stoker, the Scholomance was not just a rumor. It became the fictional foundation for how his vampire could control wolves, command storms, and walk in darkness. What makes the story even more compelling is the role of the Zmeu, the dragon serpent that sleeps beneath the nameless lake. In Romanian folklore, the Zmeu was a symbol of destructive greed and otherworldly hunger. Linking it to the Devil's Apprentice suggested that magic and monstrosity were inseparable. The final student, condemned to ride the creature, was no longer a man, but something new, a hybrid of sorcerer and beast. Some researchers even tied this to older myths of Lilith and Samael, or the Sumerian Lilitu, seeing in the Scholomance a continuation of the same theme. Humanity's pact with darkness, sealed through knowledge, and transformed into a curse. The strange thing is, how much of this seems to survive in distorted form. When Naomi Novik wrote her modern fantasy novels about the Scholomance, many readers assumed she had invented the myth. In reality, she was only drawing from what Gerard and the Romanian peasants had already said more than a century earlier. Even if the details are blurred by rumor, the core idea refuses to die. A school of darkness, hidden in the Carpathians, where knowledge is inseparable from damnation. Legends about the Scholomance were not vague. They described in unnerving detail what the devil supposedly taught his chosen students. The curriculum read less like philosophy and more like a manual for bending nature to human will. One of the first lessons was weather. A true Solomonar, the name given to graduates, could summon storms out of clear skies, break droughts with sudden rain, or hurl hailstones that shredded fields. Villagers believed they carried secret instruments, carved rods or enchanted books, which allowed them to direct clouds as if they were cattle. The most terrible part was that these powers cut both ways. A Solomonar might protect a harvest if paid in advance, or ruin it if angered. For peasants whose survival depended on fragile crops, the suspicion that a storm was sent by a neighbor trained in the Scholomance was enough to breed fear and resentment. Communication with spirits was another domain. The devil himself, or his emissary, was said to initiate students into pacts with unseen beings. These were not just idle superstitions. In practice, villagers would attribute sudden accidents, madness, or livestock illness to the intervention of demons sent by a Solomonar. The very fact that these men could speak to forces beyond human control made them both indispensable and dangerous. People would seek them out for protection against curses, then whisper about them as the cause of disasters. Most disturbing of all were the dragons. Folklore insisted that beneath lakes in the Carpathians slept colossal serpents called Balauri. To ride such a beast was the highest sign of mastery. Some versions claimed the final student, taken as tribute by the devil, was given command of a Balar as both servant and prison. The creature was said to rise during storms, coiling through the clouds, carrying its rider above the world. For villagers who saw lightning cleaving the sky, it was easy to imagine a dragon moving behind the storm. Graduates of the Scholomance, the Solomonari, were treated with a peculiar mix of awe and suspicion. They could arrive in a village and demand food or coin, threatening to unleash storms if refused. At the same time, desperate farmers sometimes hired them, believing their power could divert hail away from their fields. It was a relationship built on fear. Every harvest lost to frost, every cow fallen ill, every child stricken with fever might be blamed on a Solomonar's hidden hand. Yet without them, peasants felt defenseless against the very forces that ruled their lives. For peasants in Transylvania, epidemics were not explained with microbes or invisible pathogens. They were explained with the dead. When an entire family sickened, when livestock collapsed, or when half a village began coughing blood, the explanation was simple. A restless corpse was feeding. The body itself seemed to confirm the suspicion. When villagers exhumed graves, they often found corpses that did not look peaceful. Some were bloated, their stomachs swollen as if they had feasted underground. And the most terrible detail was the sound. When these bodies were pierced or burned, gases escaping the torso produced moans or groans that villagers swore were proof of the dead still being alive. In reality, It was decomposition. But to an untrained eye and ear, it looked like a monster crying out. Blood at the mouth was another sign. During decomposition, fluids from the lungs and stomach rise and leak through the nose and lips. In the flicker of torchlight, this looked like evidence that the corpse had just drunk from the living. Even more disturbing was the illusion created by shrinking skin. As the flesh pulled tight around the fingers, nails seemed to grow. As it receded on the skull, hair and beards appeared longer. For terrified villagers, it meant that the dead were still changing after burial, continuing their existence in secret. Diseases only strengthened these fears. Tuberculosis, known as consumption, was especially cruel. A single infected member of a household would waste away slowly, coughing blood, then the next, and the next, until an entire family line seemed drained. To observers, it looked like a dead relative had returned invisibly, feeding one by one. Plague outbreaks triggered the same panic. When dozens died in a matter of days, rumors spread that revenants had been unleashed from a nearby graveyard, spreading death faster than the living could bury their dead. This is why villagers resorted to extreme measures. Graves were opened, corpses decapitated, stakes driven through hearts, bodies burned. These were not isolated acts of superstition. They were communal rituals of survival. If half your household was gone in a week and you found blood on the lips of a corpse, it was not hard to believe that you were looking at the enemy. The fear was not abstract. It was tied to the most immediate terror of all: losing your children, your livestock, your harvest, and watching your entire community collapse. The funeral carts and opened graves from our previous section lead straight into the 20th century. Villagers once blamed revenants for epidemics. A German filmmaker translated that terror into moving images and gave it a face. The funeral carts and opened graves from our previous section lead straight into the 20th century. Villagers once blamed revenants for epidemics. A German filmmaker translated that terror into moving images and gave it a face. One of the strangest and most disturbing chapters in the history of vampirism is that it was not confined to rumors whispered in villages. In the 17th and 18th centuries, entire communities brought their fears into courtrooms. What began as superstition ended up written in official records. Local tribunals in regions like Serbia, Moravia, and Wallachia treated suspected cases of vampirism as legal matters, complete with testimonies, rulings, and sanctioned punishments for the dead. The process usually started the same way: a cluster of sudden deaths, or a family that wasted away one after another. Villagers would accuse a recently deceased neighbor of rising from the grave. In some cases, people swore they had seen the figure at night, pressing down on them in their beds or roaming near their homes. The fear became so overwhelming that local authorities stepped in, not to dismiss it, but to control it. That's what makes these trials so chilling. They were not fringe behavior, but procedures acknowledged by institutions. The records are explicit. Exhumations were ordered, and the corpses described in the language of law. Judges wrote about bloated bodies, ruddy complexions, fresh blood in the mouth, all taken as signs of feeding. The remedies were equally systematic. The corpse was pierced with a stake, decapitated, or burned. In many files, the act of staking is mentioned almost clinically, as if it were no different from enforcing a sentence of imprisonment. What makes this especially strange is how the paperwork transforms ritual violence into civic duty. The case of Arnold Paul in Serbia, recorded in 1726, is one of the most famous. Paul, a soldier, was said to have been attacked by a vampire while stationed on the Turkish frontier. After his death, neighbors claimed he returned, tormenting the living and causing deaths in his village. A full investigation followed, with exhumations and detailed reports by military surgeons who confirmed signs of vampirism. These accounts spread across Europe, feeding the so-called vampire panic. Other trials followed. In Moravia, corpses were dug up, examined, and punished by order of magistrates who saw themselves as protecting public health. What is most terrible here is the collision between folklore and bureaucracy. Villagers had always feared the restless dead, but now priests, doctors, and officers put their seals on the same fear. The vampire stepped out of oral legend and into stamped documents and wax seals. To the people of the time, that made it real beyond question. If a court ruled a corpse guilty and ordered it mutilated, then the vampire was no longer just a rumor. It was a legal category of threat. These trials marked the moment when vampirism reached its highest level of credibility. The belief was no longer confined to fireside tales or graveyard whispers. It was written into the machinery of society itself. And perhaps the strangest part is how these files still exist. Fragile papers that show how law once tried to manage the supernatural, reducing fear to procedure while deepening it at the same time. In 1922, Friedrich Wilhelm Murnau released Nosferatu, an unauthorized riff on Dracula whose names and details were altered to dodge legal trouble. The changes did something unexpected. They sharpened the link between vampirism and disease. Count Orlok sails to the port of Wisborg aboard the Empusa, and with him come rats, sealed coffins, and death. The ship's log records crewmen dropping one by one, as if a sickness were moving through the hold. When the vessel drifts in unmanned, authorities declare an outbreak. Streets empty, windows stay shut, funeral processions multiply. What audiences saw looked uncomfortably close to recent memory. Europe had just lived through the 1918 influenza pandemic, so the sight of deserted squares and stacked coffins felt like documentary more than fantasy. Friedrich Wilhelm Murnau's camera work reinforces the idea of contagion spreading across space. The sea voyage as vector, the unloading of coffins as transmission, the chalked crosses on doors as crude epidemiology. One of the most terrible images is the parade of townspeople carrying their own caskets, a ritual of resignation that turns the entire city into a morgue. Friedrich Wilhelm Murnau strips away the aristocratic seducer and presents a cadaverous intruder. Orlok's body tells the whole story. Bald skull, sunken eyes, rodent teeth, clawed fingers. The design echoes vermin and plague myths rather than ballroom elegance. Even the famous shadow creeping up the staircase behaves like an infection, taking a house, floor by floor. A very strange decision, and a decisive one, is the flood of rats that follows Orlok wherever he goes. The animals externalize the unseen threat. They become the moving texture of disease, turning every alley and cellar into a reservoir of contagion. Production choices tighten the metaphor. Friedrich Wilhelm Murnau shot exteriors on real streets, Wismar, Lübeck, instead of expressionist sound stages, so the quarantine town feels lived in and vulnerable. Intertitles and notices posted in the diegesis speak the language of public health, orders, warnings, counting the dead, while churches mark doors with crosses to signal plague inside. The film welds the priest's symbol to the bureaucrat's registry, and the result looks like medieval pest control reinvented for modern bureaucracy. There is a grim logic to how the horror resolves. Books inside the narrative insist that only a woman who keeps the vampire until cockcrow can break the scourge. Ellen offers herself, holding Orlok at her bedside through the night. Dawn arrives, the sunlight destroys him, and the deaths stop. The cure is not medicine, quarantine, or prayer. It is the elimination of the source of contagion. One of the most unsettling implications is how neatly this maps onto centuries of scapegoating during real outbreaks. Find the carrier, end the crisis, whatever the cost. The fallout outside the story is just as haunting. Stoker's estate sued Prana Film, and a court ordered the prints destroyed. Almost everything was meant to vanish. One thing that is very strange is how a handful of copies survived and multiplied, exactly like the contagion the movie depicts. The image that took hold in popular culture was not the charming noble of the Victorian novel, but Friedrich Wilhelm Murnau's pestilential revenant, thin, grey, and unstoppable until the sun burns it away. By the time Nosferatu had finished haunting audiences, the vampire had become an image of epidemic and decay, a cadaver with rats at his feet and plague in his shadow. Yet Bram Stoker's original vision worked differently. His count carried the mark of the Scholomance, described as a figure who studied forbidden arts and mastered storms, fog, animals, and contagion with deliberate purpose. Dracula emerged as a strategist with an occult education, a nobleman whose powers came from knowledge as much as from undeath. When Bram Stoker wrote Dracula, he planted a detail that many readers overlook. Van Helsing mentions that the Count himself studied at the Scholomance, the fabled school of the devil in the Carpathians. It is only a passing reference in the novel, yet it rewires how we should understand the character. This link explains why Stoker's vampire is so different from the Strigoi and Moroi of peasant lore. Dracula does not wander blindly or act like a mindless revenant. He operates with the discipline of someone trained. His powers, to summon storms, to command wolves and bats, to spread fog across landscapes, to infest ships with rats and plague, all echo the curriculum that legend assigned to the Scholomance. Rather than an accidental monster, he becomes a graduate of a hidden academy where the devil shaped students into weapons. The implications are disturbing. A Strigoi might attack its relatives or ruin a field of cattle, but Dracula organizes campaigns across borders. He calculates shipping routes, prepares lairs, and drains victims with the patience of a tactician. Behind every act lies the mark of a structured education. The storm that wrecks the Demeter is not chance weather. It is a lesson applied. The sudden swarms of vermin in Whitby are not random infestations. They mirror the old belief that Scholomance students could control creatures from beneath the earth and the water. What makes this detail powerful is that it merges two traditions. On one side, the epidemic fears of rural Transylvania, where the dead were blamed for wasting sickness and plague. On the other, the legend of the Scholomance, where chosen pupils mastered the elements under the devil's eye. Stoker fused them into a single figure, an aristocrat whose very existence is tied to disease, yet whose methods carry the precision of occult training. The result is a villain that feels larger than folklore. Dracula is not explained by panic over decomposition, nor by the mistakes of villagers digging up graves. He is presented as a conscious enemy, an aristocrat with a curriculum of darkness who uses knowledge as much as hunger to spread his influence. That single connection to the Scholomance elevates him from the chaos of superstition into a structured myth. The vampire as strategist, plague-bearer, and sorcerer all at once. The first major theory looks straight at medicine, or rather, the absence of it. Before modern science, people could only rely on their senses when trying to understand what happened to a body after death. They dug up graves, and the evidence seemed horrifying. A corpse buried for a week did not look like a lifeless husk. The abdomen bloated, the skin stretched, and dark liquids sometimes seeped from the mouth. Villagers believed this was proof the dead had been feeding. When a stake or blade pierced the body, gases escaped with a hiss that sounded like a groan. The most terrible part was that noise, as if the grave itself confirmed their fears. Add to that the illusion created by decomposition, skin pulling back so that nails and hair looked longer, beards appearing fuller, as though the body had been changing underground. Without knowledge of biology, everything pointed to one conclusion: the corpse was still active. Disease completed the picture. Tuberculosis was especially cruel. One family member coughed blood until death, then another, until the household felt hunted. Rabies outbreaks added to the nightmare. Villagers bitten by dogs became aggressive, foamed at the mouth, recoiled from water. To anyone watching, these weren't symptoms, they were transformations. The pattern of infection matched perfectly with the stories of the restless dead, draining vitality. In that climate, the vampire became the only explanation that made sense. The strange thing is how each medical symptom, wasting, bleeding, sudden aggression, aligned so neatly with the folklore. It was less a fantasy than a desperate attempt to give shape to terrifying realities no one could control. The second theory shifts from medicine to power. Here the vampire is not just a corpse in the grave, but an image of social exploitation. In peasant villages, there was already a figure who drained life from others: the feudal lord. He demanded grain, livestock, and taxes year after year, while tenants struggled to survive. People whispered that their rulers never truly died, that their wealth and authority stretched across generations, while peasants fell into hunger and sickness. The comparison was unavoidable. A landowner who fed on the work of others looked exactly like the creature described in legend. This idea carried into literature. Bram Stoker sharpened it in Dracula. His count is not an aimless wanderer, he is an aristocrat making deliberate moves. He buys properties, organizes shipments of earth, spreads corruption, and extends his influence across borders. Readers in 1897 understood this on a gut level. The vampire reflected fears of exploitation and invasion, of power that never stops feeding. For Victorians, Dracula wasn't simply a supernatural threat, he was a mirror of the aristocracy itself, turned into a predator that literally lived off the people. A third theory digs into psychology. The vampire is not just something people saw in graves or blamed on lords, it is also something they felt pressing on their own minds. For centuries, people described waking at night unable to move, a crushing weight on the chest, the sense that something invisible was feeding on them. Today, we call it sleep paralysis, but back then, it was a nocturnal visitation. The strangest part was how consistent these reports were. Entire villages agreed that the same thing was happening. People opened their eyes and found themselves trapped, their life leaking away without a sound. Add in the pull of desire and addiction, cravings that leave people exhausted yet desperate for more, and you have a perfect internal match for the external myth. The vampire becomes the shape of forbidden urges, the shadow that consumes without ever being satisfied. The fourth theory comes from the occult, where vampires are not seen as walking corpses, but as energetic predators. In these traditions, a psychic vampire is someone who drains the vitality of others, often without bloodshed. They leave their victims feeling hollow, anxious, or broken, while appearing stronger themselves. Romanian legends of the Solomonari, graduates of the Scholomance, fit neatly into this idea. These figures were said to command storms, ride dragons, and bargain with spirits. Villagers both feared and paid them, blaming them for ruined harvests or thanking them when the weather broke. The most unsettling detail is that the same person could be seen as a savior one season and a predator the next. Power over life and death made them unavoidable, and the community's survival often depended on appeasing them. In this frame, the vampire is not a corpse rising from a grave, but a human channeling invisible forces, someone who manufactures the threat in order to profit from the cure. When you put these psychological and occult layers together, the vampire stops being confined to folklore. It moves into the personal and the unseen. Nightmares, compulsions, and draining relationships all wear its face. And in the esoteric sense, the figure embodies the fear that there are always hidden predators, not necessarily drinking blood, but feeding on energy, attention, or even the belief of those around them. History left a paper trail of fear: peasants opening graves, magistrates authorizing stakes, surgeons describing fresh corpses, and a filmmaker who turned all of that into plague on a screen. The same landscape that birthed Strigoi and Moroi also imagined a school where storms could be manufactured and famine steered like a herd. One tradition gave the monster a motive: hunger. The other gave it an education, method. Nosferatu grew from that crossing. A misheard word sharpened by Emily Gerard, a curriculum hinted by the Scholomance, and a nobleman recast by Stoker as a strategist of contagion. Murnau stripped the charm away and left a cadaver with rats at his feet. Audiences recognized the pattern because the world had already lived it. Quarantines, empty streets, chalk marks on doors, and the search for a carrier to blame. The fear never retired. Epidemics still redraw cities. Power still feeds in silence. Nightmares still sit on the chest at 3 a.m. Every age picks its version of the vampire: feudal lord, bureaucratic stamp, shipborne pestilence, shadow in a stairwell. And every age invents a scholomance to explain who learned to pull the strings. A court ordered Nosferatu to vanish. Copies slipped away and multiplied. That afterlife says more than any lecture. Legends designed to manage terror learn to survive it. As long as hunger, disease, and manipulation keep finding new shapes, the vampire keeps finding a way back to the door.